Hey guys, Lucas Garvey here, and today I'm going to be talking about the only screenwriting book that I personally care about. And I know, kind of an extreme statement, might be a bit controversial, but I've read dozens of books on screenwriting and how to write and the magic of telling a good story. And a lot of them tend to be not really good. A good screenwriting book will have one decent nugget of information, and the other 99% of the book tends to not be that worthwhile, right? And the main issues is that they're overly specific. They're always like, oh, on page 15, you gotta make sure that your hero does this kind of a thing, and then that kind of a thing leads to this kind of a thing, and then at the midpoint of the story, this kind of a thing happens. Which it's very just. I don't want to use the word formulaic because that's kind of cliche. But it's just very, almost ridiculously pedantic. And I've always found that not just only in screenwriting, but in just about every aspect of life, you're a lot better off understanding the essentials, understanding the foundation, as opposed to trying to memorize 300 rules and tips and all that. Because really? You're going to memorize 300 tips and be able to summon any of them at the drop of a hat? Like, really, you're going to juggle 300 tips and merge them all together? No, you're way better off, in my experience, understanding the thing itself and not having to rely on tips, just understanding exactly the thing in and of itself. And the book I'm going to talk about today, which I think does this perfectly for screenwriting, is the book Story by Robert McKee. This book is awesome. I love it. Out of all the books on screenwriting that I've read, it completely destroys every other book. The best of the other books, there might be one or two good sentences or one or two decent ideas in the entire 200, 300-page book. But this book is nonstop slamming with awesome information, I think at least. I'm going to go through this book and talk about, personally, what I took away the most and what I thought was most interesting. So a great little sentence early on that Robert McKee gives us, which I think he delves into for the rest of the book, but I think it's summarized brilliantly early on. And here he says, "The mark of a master is to select only a few moments, but give us a lifetime." And what he means by that, it's pretty straightforward, but pretty much what he's saying is that the editorial process cannot be overlooked. You know what I mean? You can't. The mark of a great author isn't, 9 out of the 10 scenes they write are brilliant, right? The mark of a great author is they can write 100 scenes and they will pick the 10 best scenes from the bunch, right? And that's maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but you get the point, right? The ability to say no, that is pivotal to the creative expression. And I think even Steve Jobs or somebody like that said something like that once upon a time, where the ability to say no, I'm not going to do that, is great, because so many amateur artists, they just do the first thing off the top of their head, and there can be a beauty to that. I do know the whole stream of consciousness kind of thinking. However, most of the time, if you're trying to make something really as good as you can make it, is your first idea really the best you can do? Maybe trying to distill it to the core foundation, and then taking that and comparing it to something else and saying, well, which one's better? Like the editorial, and I think that's kind of the thing that gets missed the most. And the cool thing about the editorial process is that's, in my opinion, way easier to learn than the creative process. The creative process, it's difficult to hammer away and do consistently. Like, how many hours a day could you produce creative content? Like, it's really difficult. But for editing, like just looking through something and saying, I like this more than that, it's almost like cardio. Like, you can almost do it all day, like just for hours and hours and hours on end. It's way easier. But yeah, just a really interesting pivot of focus from, all right, the creative stuff's important, but also an appreciation and understanding of cutting and taking things away as opposed to adding and adding and adding, really separates the master from the amateur, so to say. So earlier when I was saying that McKee explains the underlying understanding of what a story really is, this next section is what I was really referring to. This next section is where he pretty much explains what a story is, which might sound kind of like a ridiculous question to even say, like, what's a story? But I think it's completely misunderstood by most people. Like, you just got to think, what's a story? A sequence of events? Well, not really. If I told you a random series of events, is that really a story? No, there's something else to it. There's something beneath the events that actually makes it a story. And the better and stronger that is, the greater the story, right? And what that is, to finally get to the point, what that is the controlling idea. And right off the bat, it's similar to theme, right? It's very similar to the idea of theme. However, I think they're dramatically different. Theme can often be very vague and have no direction. For example, I wrote a story. The theme is about childhood. Okay, well, like, what are you saying about childhood? Like, what's new? Like, what's being said? What do you mean by childhood? Or I'm making a coming of age story. Okay, what are you making about a coming of age story? So often, themes can come off as, I'm making a macabre, existential movie, let's say. And it's like, well, not really, because it's not even a story, because it's just a series of macabre existential scenes. There's no progression. There's no composition. There's nothing really pushing the narrative and the story forward. It's just a sequence of depressing, macabre events. So it's not really a story. But specifically, in terms of how the controlling idea is different, McKee says, a controlling idea may be expressed in a single sentence describing how and why life undergoes change from one condition of existence at the beginning to another at the end. So what he's saying is that with any story, with any movie, with any book, any play, anything, right, there is a point A, which is the beginning, and a point B, which is the end. And these have to be different. It's not really a story if the beginning and the ending are identical. And when I mean identical, I mean really identical. Because, sometimes you have stories where the hero's at home, he's destroyed, and then he's built back up, and he returns home. But typically, there is a slightly different character. Whether he's developed more, or he has some newfound responsibility, whatever the case may be, there is a difference. But a story is not a story if the beginning and the ending are identical. And what's actually kind of interesting is they could be identical, but the audience's understanding of them would have to be different. That could also be a story. And that would almost be like a Memento kind of a thing, right? Where the beginning and the end are identical. However, the audience is perceiving it completely differently, which is interesting. But kind of going back to the controlling idea thing. With the controlling idea, all you have to do to figure out the controlling idea to any story is ask the question, what is the cause or factor that is taking us from point A to point B? Is it determination? The character was determined, and that's what got from point A to point B. Was it corruption? Was the character destroyed, and it was from point A to point B? Was it greed? Was it, any slew of factors? Like, what's the factor? And typically, one-word explanations might be boring, I guess you could say, because, if the whole story is just about a person who's greedy, that might just, and they get their comeuppance, that might not be the most interesting thing ever, right? But so McKee says a sentence. You should be able to explain it in a sentence. What's that factor that takes us from A to B? And that's really the whole thing for a controlling idea, which I think is absolutely spot on. I think is completely correct. The idea that underlying factor, that controlling idea that's being stated without actually being stated, is the bloodline of a story in a lot of ways. McKee phrases all of that in a bit more of a succinct and elaborated way. So just very briefly, he says, looking at your ending, ask, as a result of this climactic action, what value, positively or negatively charged, is brought into the world of my protagonist? Next, tracing backward from the climax, dig into the bedrock, ask, what is the chief cause, force, or means by which this value is brought into his world? The sentence you compose from the answers to those two questions becomes your controlling idea. So again, all you have to do to figure out a controlling idea is look at point A, look at point B, figure out what is the chief cause that takes us from point A to B. And a lot of times, and he kind of says this down here, but sometimes it's a lot easier. You write the story, going to point B and working backwards. Sometimes that can be a lot more obvious and be like, oh, of course, that's the cause. Whereas going from the beginning to, the beginning to the ending, it might not be as clear. Whereas going from the end to the beginning, it's a lot more obvious what that cause, that major factor might have been. So here, McKee talks about idea versus counter idea. And this is vital, I think. I think this is pivotal to a really engrossing, fantastic story, right? Because a lot of bad stories, they have a propagandic theme, a propagandic controlling idea, where the entire story is just, it's bad to be cruel to others, I guess you could say. And the whole story is about some guy who's overly cruel, or a guy who's overly too much of a loner, or just anything. Like the whole story just hits the same beat over and over and over and over again. It's just, every scene is identical. Every scene, no scene adds anything new. No scene changes the dynamic. Every scene is just bing, 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 just hammering you over the head for 2 hours, and it's unbelievably boring, right? So McKee says that it's a lot more preferable to have the idea and the counter idea. So with this cruel concept, maybe, so let's say at the end of the movie, the cruel guy gets his comeuppance, right? Maybe you have the counter idea, oh, well, to get what you want in life, you have to be cruel, right? And you really have to believe in the idea when you're telling it, because, you could just give like a weak, half-hearted attempt to elaborate on the opposite of what you're trying to express. But then that only weakens the overarching story. Like you really have to think, could the exact opposite of what I'm trying to convey be true, right? And if you're able to build up the controlling idea that you're trying to convey, and at the same time build up the counterpoint, the exact opposite of the counter idea you're trying to convey, and have those clash together, well, then that's just ultimate conflict, and it's an absolutely fantastic story. And if you can really do that, and it's kind of tough because, you have to kind of lay yourself down and say, well, because typically, a controlling idea is going to be representative of your personal belief at the end of the day. So you really have to look at it and say, can the other side of the fence be correct? And like really delving into believing in that. So I really think the idea of expounding on the controlling idea is awesome. And really, you should be doing it. There's different levels of perspective, right? You should be doing it every scene, right? I think where one scene, the controlling idea wins, then the next scene, the counter idea, the counter idea wins, and then it's the idea wins, and then the counter idea, and each time it has to be a build-in progression, a build-in, power, right? Swinging back and forth from idea to counter idea. It's almost like they're constantly trying to usurp each other. These two ideas are battling to the death, trying to win out, so to speak, like trying to one up each other. That's the idea. And I think that is awesome. And I think it leads to really engrossing, awesome stories. Real quick, McKee actually has a little diagram, which I'm too lazy to edit. So I'm just going to show you. I'm just going to, bring the book up. I'm going to have to get in here, change focus. Oh, there we go. All right, take a look. So as you can kind of see, you probably can't hear me at all. So as you can kind of see, cool. It's that whole swinging back and forth every scene until you reach that last climactic action. And that climactic action, arguably, should be completely irreversible. There should be no going back. There can't be no, well, what if, maybe the counter idea could have won out. It's like, no, the ultimate conclusion should be as irreversible as possible, typically. So not only should it be every scene jumps back and forth, but preferably every beat within a scene, there should be some momentum of jumping back and forth. And, a lot of stories don't have just one idea that they're trying to convey. A lot of times it can be multiple things, but they all tend to be kind of capitulated in what you might be able to call the more overarching, vague idea of a theme. But the controlling idea concept really just lets you get a better handle and grasp of what's really even supposed to mean at the end of the day, which I like. So in this next section, McKee delves into character, right? And I know I have a bit of a tendency to really overemphasize plot and the events in the story. So this might be refreshing to some of you longtime viewers. So here McKee is making the argument that a hero is born, a character is born in the gap between themselves and the reality around them, right? And he actually has an awesome diagram. So it's time for another focus change right here. All right, so I'm just going to explain this diagram. I'm holding it up to the camera right now. So the protagonist is going to take an initial first action to reach his object of desire, right? However, this first action is not going to work due to external factors and conflicts. Inner conflict, personal conflict, extra-personal conflict, which I'll explain in just a little second. But pretty much, these conflicts are going to make it where the protagonist will not succeed on his first attempt. So, right here, he's going to have to make a second action, which, dun dun dun, has risk, right? Now, this is so cool. And I know that diagram was very simple, right? It wasn't this crazy complicated overlapping mandala kind of a diagram. But I think it's absolutely correct, right? The character has an object of desire that he wants. They take an initial first action, and typically that first action should be as bare bones as humanly possible. Because why would your character do anything than what was needed? You know what I mean? So he's going to do the bare minimum to get his goal. But in a story, it's not going to work. Or if it does work, then it'd be over. The story would be over, and he would have what he wants. So you're going to have inner, personal, and extra-personal conflicts stopping him, and that's the real world is going to stop him from succeeding. So then he has to step aside, take a second action, and typically that second action is going to have a bit more risk involved, or it's just going to be a bit more complicated, not as easy as that first initial action. And that event, right, that gap event, will happen dozens and dozens of times in a story until you reach the ultimate conclusion where the character cannot think of a greater sacrifice or a greater anything. The story cannot proceed forward from that point. And real quickly, for those three conflicts I listed, they're pretty straightforward. Inner conflict, internal mumbo jumbo, you get that. Personal conflicts between two people, like, oh, you cheated on me, da, 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 that kind of a thing. Then, extra personal conflicts, the world, there's a meteor, something like that. So those are the kind of things I'm talking about. And what's so interesting about this gap idea is a representation of the gap between the hero's soul and the environment that they are living in. Because typically, you want to have some sort of harmonious junction. Like, you want to be all locked in and good to go. And typically, if you can't get what you want, if the actions that you take don't produce the things that you want, it's likely that you're not as in sync with your environment or as fully developed as you want to. That's not always the case. Always is luck and everything. But a lot of times, especially in a story, it's kind of a representation of you not being lined up exactly. So this gap idea is awesome. And really, I think it's mandatory, right? Every scene, the character has to get their object of desire, and pretty much every single time, they should have some level of failure until the end, for the most part. Another quick diagram. This is just kind of showing a more expanded view of the diagram. Let's pull it up. So this is a more thorough diagram. You can see there's about four actions, 4 gaps until he reaches that object of desire. And right there, you can see right before that object of desire, you can see that McKee puts down to the end of the line. And really, that's where these gaps should take the audience. They should take the audience and the hero to the very edge of his capabilities where he cannot go any further. Cool. Magic. So here, McKee elaborates on this gap. Here, he says, the gap between expectation and result is far more than a matter of cause and effect, in the most profound sense. The break between the cause as it seems and the effect as it turns out marks the point where the human spirit and the world meet. On one side is the world as we believe it to be. On the other is reality as it actually is. In this gap is the nexus of story, the cauldron that cooks our tellings. Here, the writer finds the most powerful, life-bending moments. The only way we can reach this crucial junction is by working from the inside out. So in this next section, McKee is talking about rhythm versus repetition. And rhythm, beautiful thing. I've made a video about rhythm. Go check it out. It's about like Kanye and Shakespeare and all that. It's dope. Check it out. But here he talks about repetition and how it's bad mojo. It's really not the way. It really sucks. You should kind of avoid repetition as much as possible. And on that, he says, the dynamics of story depend on the alternation of its value charges. For example, the two most powerful scenes in a story are the last two act climaxes. This would be the end of the third act and the end of the second act. The ultimate climax and the penultimate climax. On screen, they're often only 10 or 15 minutes apart. Therefore, they cannot repeat the same charge. If the protagonist achieves his object of desire, making the last act story climax positive, then the penultimate act climax must be negative. You cannot set up an upending with an upending. So here McKee delves into the crisis and the climax of a story. And a lot of it's pretty straightforward and kind of lines up with the rest of his thinking, but there's definitely some really awesome nuggets of elaborate information. And as you could guess, the climax tends to be the most important part of any story. It's vital, and I'm sure we've all seen movies where it was pretty good and then the ending was horrific and it's like, well, what was even the point? Like, there's no point, right? It's like without a good ending, like, what's the point? The whole thing becomes meaningless without a concrete, solid endpoint, so to say. So pretty much the crisis and the climax should be the most intense scene of the movie. That makes sense. That's not too out there. That seems pretty easy peasy to understand. It should be the most intense forces of antagonism that the character ever faces, which also makes sense. So I'm going to say a little quote real quick from McKee. He says, the crisis must be true dilemma, a choice between irreconcilable goods, the lesser of two evils, or the two at once that plays the protagonist under the maximum pressure of his life. McKee talks about having a crisis within a climax. And McKee argues that this is the foundation of the greatest endings of stories. That this is the foundation of a brilliant ending. That you can have a really good ending without this, but to have a memorable, soul-hitting ending, implementing a crisis within your climax is really the way to do it. And specifically, McKee says, the action the protagonist chooses to take becomes the story's consummate event, causing a positive, negative, or ironically positive, negative story climax. If, however, as the protagonist takes the climactic action, we once more pry apart the gap between expectation and result. If we can split probability from necessity just one more time, we may create a majestic ending the audience will treasure for a lifetime. For a climax built around a turning point is the most satisfying of all. And I think McKee uses a perfect example. And it's a great example because it's something that everybody knows. The Empire Strikes Back, right? And on that, he says, The Empire Strikes Back corkscrews its climax. Face to face with Darth Vader, Luke is met by a crisis of courage, irreconcilable goods. He could attack and kill Vader, or he could flee and save his life. The lesser of two evils. He could attack Vader and be killed, or he could flee, making him a coward and betraying his friends. Luke musters his courage and chooses to fight. However, when Vader suddenly steps back and says, "You can't kill me, Luke. I am your father." Luke's reality splinters. In a flash, he realizes the truth, and now must yet make another crisis decision, whether to kill his own father. Luke confronts the agony of this decision and chooses to fight, but Vader cuts off his hand and Luke drops to the deck. Still, it's not over. Vader announces that he wants Luke to join his campaign to bring order to things in the universe. A second gap opens as Luke realizes that his father doesn't want him dead. He's offering him a job. He must make a third crisis decision, a lesser of two evil dilemma, to join the dark side or take his own life. He makes a heroic choice, and as these gaps explode, the climax delivers deep rushes of insight, uniting two films. So obviously, Empire Strikes Back is arguably the most well-known ending to any movie or any story ever. So for him to use it as an example makes a lot of sense. And you can really just feel it, just the way that McKee talks about it. Like, these gaps, it's not just a gap. It's the explosion of expectation and reality. It's like, it's mind-boggling. What, you're my father? What? Okay, now you want to make me a job? Like, it's so, it's the soul of a story, ultimately, at the end of the day. And yeah, I think McKee's absolutely correct. I think if you're able to implement a satisfying gap in your climax, and maybe, a couple times, like Empire Strikes Back, then you're really set for a brilliant story. However, it's it's really difficult. Like it's difficult for a couple of reasons. It's difficult because it has to up everything before it. So the whole time the audience is thinking that this is the climax, you have to still have 2 or 3 more charges left to be able to corkscrew a climax in that way, right? So you have to be able to convince the audience that we're at the end of the road, but really, you have a couple more tricks up your sleeve, which could be a difficult thing to pull off. And it also can't feel cheap because, you could kill everybody. That's a corkscrew ending. But if it's not earned, then it's almost meaningless, right? So like for, in Empire Strikes Back, the idea of Luke, I am your father, that's kind of set up with, Obi-Wan saying, he killed his father, which then, kind of gets explained later in the other movies. So you really have to set up these corkscrew elements. And, McKee always talks about writing backwards. It's super important you write your story, you figure out the ending. It's like, all right, what do I do going backwards to make this ending as powerful and as hard-hitting as humanly imaginable? And I think writing backwards helps a lot. And I think adding crisis into your climax helps a lot. So this next section, McKee delves into the principle of antagonism. And right off the bat, I'm just going to say, I really think McKee was at the edge of his knowledge when writing this chapter. Because for a lot of the chapter, he really relies on examples to explain what he's talking about, which he does explain it a decent amount, but it is kind of hard to wrap your mind around. It's probably the most challenging thing in this book, I think at least. So just be ready. There might be some stuff that's kind of hard to get succinctly. So earlier we talked about how a story doesn't just need to be able to elaborate on its positive element, its controlling idea, but it has to be able to elaborate on the antithetical side of that. It's the counter idea. And if it can't do that, then it's going to come off as propagandic in a sense. But McKee actually goes a step further. McKee says that to really go to the very limit of human experience and to go to the edge of your soul of a story, there are 4 stages, so to speak, that you kind of have to be able to go through to the climax, right? And he says, so you have the positive idea, the controlling idea, the positive element. There's also the contrary, the contradictory, and the negation of the negation. And we're just going to deconstruct those one by one. So the controlling idea, it's pretty obvious. It's a controlling idea. We've already talked about it a ton. So that's that, right? I think it's actually going to be easier if we skip over the contrary and go to the contradictory. The contradictory, it's just it's the negative, right? So here's an example. Let's say justice, that's like the overarching controlling idea that you're trying to elaborate on. Injustice is this would be the counter idea. That's the contradictory, right? So you have those 2 ideas. But in between those, because you can't always just jump from one to the other, sometimes you want to have a contrary, right? So it's not exactly injustice, but it's definitely not justice either. So for this, he uses the word unfairness. It's not injustice, but it's unfairness. And typically, the reason that you would have this is because if for the entire story, it's swinging from justice to injustice, it might get tiring, and you as the writer might just run out of steam. Can you really write about justice versus injustice for 2 hours? It might be hard. It might be kind of hard. So, he would say that really for like the first act or so, it really should be justice versus that contrary element, which here would be unfairness in this specific example. So it's kind of like a lighter energy. It's a lighter comparison, and then that should kind of build and swing up during the second act into injustice. And then finally, and this is the doozy, I think, which not only is it a doozy, it's awesome. I love this idea so much. I think it's so cool. The negation of the negation. It's the end of the road. It is the absolute maximum that a story can represent. You just can't go beyond a negation of the negation. And I'm just going to read off his words directly, and then we're going to circle back and we can kind of talk about it in a more thorough way. Negation of the negation means a compound negative in which a life situation turns not just quantitatively, but qualitatively worse. The negation of negation is at the limit of the dark powers of human nature. So the example that with this justice example that he uses is tyranny, right? It's the end of the road. And the way that I like to think about it, the negation of the negation is when the positive element isn't subtracted, but multiplied to an infinite degree. So, and this is typically going to be at the third act of the story. So we're not just talking about, is the positive idea actually stronger than the counter idea? We're saying, okay, so if we take this positive idea and take it to the maximum, if we take this to the stratosphere, is it still a good idea? Or will the darkness of it oversee its boundaries? And so with this example, justice is turned into tyranny. So justice, that's well-reformed government. But so if you kind of crank the dial on that to 11, 15, 20, if we really expound on that positive element and try to find the evil within that's what it is. It's finding the evil within that positive element, because ultimately at the end of the day, the struggle isn't about man versus his opposite or this against the opposite. It's the evil within kind of a thing. And I think that's what the negation of negation is. It's the positive element reflecting and having to search on the evil within. And so with tyranny, it's a hyper-controlled government that it's not anarchy. It's this hyper justice taken to the most grotesque extreme humanly imaginable. And that's the end of the story. That's what justice has to combat. And it's like, do I really deserve to exist? Can I really go up against the dark half of myself and survive by the end of the story? Which you're not going to do it unscathed. And what I really like about that, it's similar to like the belly of the whale idea with the hero's journey, where you have to go down into kind of like to save your father, in a sense. Like there's a certain delving into your own inner psyche, which I really like. So that negation and negation idea is awesome, right? That positive element, not only does it have to combat the negative, the positive idea has to be able to combat the absolute worst negative of its own existence. That's the end of the line. That is the end of the line for any story when taken to the absolute maximum. So here, couple things. The negation is not always going to be the same. You have one positive element, and that negation could be shown or elaborated on in multiple different ways. And I'm just going to list off some of these examples. And if you want all of them, buy the book. But I'll list a couple just so you can kind of get an idea. And I'm going to skip the contrary and the contradictory, purely because I think those are pretty straightforward. They're the opposite or slightly different. I think the negation is really kind of the harder thing to kind of get your mind around. So I'm just going to list off the examples for that. So if love's the positive, self-hate could be the negation of the negation. Alternatively, love could be the positive, and hatred masquerading as love could be the negation of the negation. Truth could become self-deception. Consciousness could be damnation. Rich could be rich, but suffering the pains of poverty. Communication, insanity, success, selling out, wisdom, stupidity perceived as intelligence, and he goes on and on and on and on about a couple of examples. If you want all the examples, pick up the book. It's pretty good. Well, it's not only pretty good, it's fantastic. I might actually give it a 10 out of 10. Personally, I think it's as good as it gets for the material it covers. But negation of negation. Awesome idea. One of the coolest ideas in this entire book, in my opinion. But one last thing on this whole negation kind of a thing. He talks about the progression, the positive versus the contrary, positive versus contradictory, and then positive versus negation of the negation. Man, that is a real tongue twister. So he says, generally, progressions run from the positive to the contrary in Act 1, to the contradictory in later acts, and finally to the negation of the negation in the last act, either ending tragically or going back to the positive with a profound difference. So there he's just talking about the progression and kind of how the story should go, because obviously if you just focus on the contradictory for the entire story, you might get tuckered out. It might just be hard to keep one-upping it. So I think this kind of idea of a progression, not only does it make it easier for the writer to kind of ease into it, it also assists in taking us to the ultimate conclusion, to that negation of negation in the final act, in the final battle with the hero and the ultimate forces of antagonism in the story. So here he makes a brilliant statement on a good character, and he explains that concept of dimensions, which we've all heard. The idea of, oh, that character was so multidimensional, he felt so real, he had so much depth. It's a term that we hear a lot, but we don't really know what that means. At least I didn't when I read this. Like, it's kind of just a vague idea, like, dimensionality. Like, it's not obvious what it means, but McKee makes the argument that it means contradictions, which is awesome, right? And what he means by that is, maybe a character is hyper ambitious, but at the same time guilt-ridden by all the terrible things he has to do for his goals, right? So instantly you have a contradiction within his psyche and within his soul. On one hand, he's ambitious and does all these, terrible things to get what he wants. Well, and, he'd be kind of a one-note guy if that was it and that was the whole thing. But then you add in this other little side where he is also at the same time guilt-ridden by these things, and you kind of have him swing back and forth. And I think that's a huge problem with a lot of stories. I've had that problem with stories that I've written, some of the characters that I've written, where the characters just kind of one note. There's no swinging. Like, we think of this idea of the arc, which is fine. It's a fine way of putting it, but in my opinion, I don't think it's really accurate, because the character doesn't just kind of swing all nicely from point A to point B, right? It should be just sliding all over the place, dun, 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 until they get to point B, right? So it's a bumpy road, so to speak. And I think this idea of contradictions, where they're kind of being pulled back and forth just internally, they're being pulled back and forth due to these sort of internal contradictions, is kind of what he means by that. And another way of looking at it, which I like this too, another way of looking at it is the character is one way in one setting and different in another. So a good example would be, let's say you have a character who's just he's just an asshole, right? He's just a jerk. He kind of brushes people off, go F yourself, that kind of a thing. He's just not a nice guy. But then, he's a real sweetheart, a real just nice guy to single moms. That says something. He has compassion for their plight and for their situation. Like that could say something about their situation. So he's an asshole, except in this circumstance, and I think that's the key. The except. My character is courageous, except for this. My character is blank, except for this. That contradiction can be such a great pivotal point of enveloping and adding depth to a character, I think. And McKee argues that you can have multiple contradictions. And he would say that the more contradictions, the more depth. Which, on the flip side, it gets complicated, can be rather difficult, because if a character, if the except clause, like if there's no reason for the contradiction, it could be kind of ridiculous. Like if one scene he does something, and then he's put in a very similar situation, he does the opposite, it becomes suspect. Now, if that difference is explained, or there's some sort of development character between the two scenes, and it could make sense. But if he just is contradictory for no reason, then it's just it's blah blah. But if you can give him a reason, or you shouldn't give him a specific reason, right? But there should be kind of like because you don't want to say, oh well, when he was a kid, this and that happened. Like really, what you want to do is it should be just understood by the audience. Like in this situation, he's like this. But in this situation, he's the opposite. And the audience should kind of get an idea of, oh, maybe it's like he's insecure about that, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. Like the audience should have an idea of why a character, or why a human being would act that way. So, awesome, right? The idea of dimensionality being contradictions is such a genius way of putting it. And it makes so much sense, because I never understood the idea of dimensionality and like what it really meant. The idea of it being contradictions within the character's soul, so to speak, is awesome. I love it. So that's pretty much all I want to talk about with Story by Robert McKee. Awesome book. I only talked about some of my favorite sections. There's tons of stuff that I really didn't touch on at all. He talks about how to use exposition carefully and image systems and just tons and tons of stuff, which, if any of that sounds interesting, if you like this video at all, buy the book. It's magic. Also, he wrote another book on dialogue, which similarly, dialogue is such a tough thing for so many people. And he just explains it so forthrightly and simply in the bedrock of it, instead of trying to give you 300 tips of how to do it. So if you're interested in that, leave a comment down below, and I might make a video talking about his dialogue book, which is also fantastic. So thanks for watching the video. We're going to wrap it up here. And I'll see you guys in the next video. And I hope you have a great, wonderful day.